Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about convection cells. So a convection cell is something that is an event that occurs when you unevenly heat a fluid. Fluids, and specifically gases and liquids, they have flow. That means they can fill in, they can fill the shape of an object. They can expand and contract. And so when we heat up air particularly, the hot air gets warmer and less dense, and it will move upwards. And so, for example, if you have a road in the middle of a field or whatever, then the road here has a low albedo. So that means that it absorbs quite a bit of energy over the day. It gets really hot, and that really hot land here is going to heat the air that's directly above it. This air gets warmed up, and then it starts to drive upwards. It starts to rise all along the road, right? All along this road, there's air that's rising upwards because of the heat that the air is receiving from the road that's getting heated by the radiation from the sun. And then to fill in the space, because you can't have a vacuum form, you can't have the air just leave, it produces a space, and that space gets filled by colder air that comes from above. Colder air is more dense, and it cools. Now, as this warm air goes up into the sky, it is not receiving the same amount of heat anymore. It's losing heat to its environment, and so it loses that heat, gets cold again, and then joins the cycle. And this becomes a circular thing where the air drops down, warms up, rises up, cools down, drops down, warms up, rises up, etc., etc. Now let's zoom out to the Earth, and the Earth is covered in these convection cycles. Now, in one idea, we could take all of this away. If the planet wasn't moving, we could think about how the Earth would have a cold region and a hot region. Hot near the equator, cold near the pole. And so we would expect that air would rise up here, and then it would drop down at the pole, and that would create one convection cell. But because the planet is so big, it actually doesn't happen that way. It in fact happens in a much more complicated way, which is what I had shown to you in the previous, is it happens in a series of convection cells. So let's go through these a little bit one by one. The first one we see is the equator cell. So at the equator, the air is very hot because that's where the sun is strongest. So the air at the equator rises, but it cools down way before it gets to the poles. It cools down around where the tropics are. So this is the tropics here. The tropics are right here along this line, and also along this line. So these are the two tropics of, oops, my wrong tropic. Tropics right around here. So the tropics are right in those two areas. And those two areas, the tropics are actually where the tropical rainforest happens. So this convection cell where the cold air is mixing with the hot air, it forms some actually very favorable weather patterns in that area. Or at least it forms a lot of rainy weather patterns, I should say. So these are called the Hadley cells. So that's this one right here. So I'm gonna maybe I should have color coded them. So let's call these the Hadley cells, and let's put them in red. Now at the top and bottom of the globe, where the water air is coldest, we have cold air, and that cold air at the very tip of the Earth is going to descend and then start to roll along the surface. So let's maybe I'll draw that. So think about it this way, that we have cold air here. It's very cold to the top, so it pulls the air down, and then it starts to roll along the surface. But as it's rolling along the surface, it is getting hit with radiation from the sun. So at some point, that air will have enough energy that it'll start to come back up and rise again. And as it rises, it moves back towards the pole, where it cools down again and forms a circle of another cycle. And this is a polar cycle because it happens in the poles. And I've drawn this image sort of twice, but you can imagine another blue arrow that goes like this. So it cools down, runs along the surface, gets hit with radiation, and that's where we get our polar cell. In between these two cells, we end up with a cell that's caused mostly by the movement of the other two cells. When these other two cells move, they actually end up butting up against the air in between, and that air ends up moving sort of like a gear, and that is what's known as a ferrule cell. And so these ferrule cells, they do have the heating and cooling aspect, but mostly they are moved by the actual movement of the air around them. And where those two air currents come together, that's what causes the ferrule cell to move. And there we go. Okay. Now I'm just playing around with my drawing. So this is another ferrule cell. And of course, there's a ferrule cell in the southern hemisphere as well. We can see one down here, and we can see one which goes this way. Notice that the polar and Hadley cells are moving in the same direction. In this example, they are moving this way and this way, so we call that clockwise. But the ferrule cell is moving counterclockwise. In the northern hemisphere, the Hadley cells are moving the Hadley cells in the southern hemisphere are moving counterclockwise, and the ferrule cells moving clockwise. And in the northern hemisphere, it's moving clockwise, and the ferrule cell moves counterclockwise. So that is the property of the ferrule cell, is that it always moves in the direction opposite to the Hadley and polar cells. Hadley and polar cells move together, and the ferrule cell moves opposite. Now, of course, it also depends on if it's on the left or the right in my picture. That part really doesn't matter because we're talking about 3 dimensions. It's supposed to be up in the air. This is you can read through this. The cold air from the poles moves towards the equator along the surface of the warm Earth and warms up long before it gets to the equator. It rises somewhere near the Arctic-Antarctic circles. So at the end of the Arctic and Antarctic circles, there happens to be this region, right? This is the end of the Arctic region or the Antarctic region down here. And so you can see that this is also an important region. Part of the ferrule cell, where the ferrule cell and the polar cell meet, is also where climate changes for those two regions for the regions of the Earth. So below the Arctic region, we start to see the change in climate towards warmer, more moderate temperatures. In this equator region, we have the Hadley inside the Hadley cells, and where the Hadley cells meet, we also have an interesting set of climate with very hot weather in that region, where the air is very hot and low density, and it's rising, and that brings with it a bunch of changes in weather. I will link to another video that goes through some of these factors. But these global convection cells have a huge influence in determining the climate of many parts of our planet. They also determine from which direction our weather will come. For example, our weather systems tend to come from the southwest, and that also plays into this. If you want a more complicated picture, I've added one into our diagram, and here you can see the Hadley cells here, and you can see the movement in the Hadley cell. Shown in this direction, and then also you can see the ferrule cell, which I'm going to label here because it's not labeled in this one. This is our ferrule cell, and this is our Hadley cell, and then this one would be our polar cell. They've called it a mid-latitude cell, but we have in our nomenclature we've used the Hadley and ferrule cells. And we're going to ignore these red arrows. We're going to focus on the cells. Now, these also, once we take into account the movement of the Earth as well, then these cells are, of course, in the up direction. But if the Earth is also moving, then we end up causing sort of a similar kind of idea of the cells, but they are the winds, and these are the westerlies, the southeasterly trades, northeasterly trades, westerlies. These winds we would talk about in different video, but probably this is going to be our last video for weather. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I will be posting a new assignment. This will be the final assignment, and it will be based on the questions at the end of this book. I do want to talk last thing about a local convection cell. So this type of cell can also happen on a smaller scale, like in a single location. If you ever grew up on a shoreline or you spent a lot of time on the shore, you might know that the wind changes direction throughout the day. So wind during the day when you live near the shore will always feel like it's coming in from the water. And that's because the water, during the day, the sun heats up the land and the sea, but the land has a lower heat capacity. So it gets to a higher temperature than the water. The hot land will also give off more heat, causing the air to heat up and rise more than the air that's over top of water. Now this rising air above the hot land will rise up into the air, and then it will descend upon the water where the air is cooled by the colder water. And so the energy of those air molecules will move from hot to cold. So the hot air will move over to the cold water, the watery air, the cold air over the water, and descend. And then that cold air in the water will move inland. And so you'll feel these breezes coming in, bringing the water with it, bringing the air with it, cold air with it. So that's, that can be really nice to be sitting on the beach and you can feel that cold air rolling in from the water supply. Now at night, the opposite thing will happen because of the high heat capacity of water. High heat capacity means that the water can store a lot of energy. So there's lots of energy stored up in here, and it will stay at the same temperature for a longer period of time. Meanwhile, the low heat capacity of the land will lose that heat very quickly, and so the land will feel colder than the water at night, initially at least. And so now the water is slightly warmer, so the air over the water is slightly warmer. And so now the air will warm up over the water, rise up, and then descend over the cold land. And so the convection cell will have reversed itself. And so in a local system like this, you can see that convection could happen. And it changes how during the day and night the weather can feel. You'll actually feel at nighttime when you're near the shore, you'll feel the air going out towards the water as opposed to during the day where it feels like the air comes inwards. All right, and with that, we are going to be done the weather unit for now. If you have interest in weather, of course, please keep reading and keep studying. But this will be the end of the weather unit. Tomorrow you will see your final assessment showing up for weather. And with that, I hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.